Well, it's very much still in process, which made this workshop so incredibly helpful for me. But basically, it came about by accident. So I went to Guatemala on a Fulbright scholarship to look specifically at the relationship between the Truth Commissions, both of them. There were two there, one run by the Catholic Church, one by the UN, and look at their role in the justice proceedings that are happening there. And I found out very quickly that even though, there was supposed to be a judicial archive where everything was centralized, in fact, they existed in disparate locations across Guatemala. And so basically, I went and in some cases went on dirt roads for 5 hours, would get to a tiny little courthouse in the middle of nowhere that didn't have a copy machine, and would basically use my iPad or phone to take pictures of these sentences. And it was the first time this was ever done. And I realized not only is it helpful for me to have access for my research to these sentences, but there's a lot of value in making them available to other academics, to Guatemalan human rights attorneys, to Guatemalan academics. And so that's the process I'm undergoing now. I've successfully collected all of the cases that have convictions. But now I'm interested in sort of building that out and collecting even more cases, so it could be a more comprehensive database of the trials. And I'm narrowly focused on trials involving human rights violations that occurred during the 36-year armed conflict in Guatemala. It's all digital, so I wasn't able to take any of the copies with me. They all still remain in the various court archives. And some of them, I should say, some I got from court archives, some I got from human rights organizations, some I got from the prosecutors who brought these cases. So it was really a myriad of places that I received these copies. But I never took a hard copy. It was important that, of course, they weren't mine to keep. For me, it's been really interesting because I've found, and this is a really big tension, that sometimes the archives revealed information that was counter to the narrative that has been sort of developing in Guatemala. I can give a couple of examples of that. So, for example, one of the, myths is that justice involving crimes that were committed during the armed conflict is a new thing. What I really discovered that is, in fact, there were many prosecutions that happened as early as the early 90s around massacres that occurred. For example, the Rio Negro massacre. There was a series of even not just prosecutions, but convictions. But they look very different than the convictions that are occurring today, which is why I think that there's so much focus on the convictions today, is because they named those as human rights violations. So they use the language of genocide, crimes against humanity, before they use crimes like homicide or kidnapping to prosecute these. And so they weren't necessarily identified as human rights trials, even though they involved things like enforced disappearances or massacres. So that's one interesting thing that I sort of discovered in actually looking at the archives and talking to human rights organizations. Another myth that I think really speaks to my research is there was a belief, so the Truth Commission in Guatemala in its mandate said that it was supposed to have no judicial effect. And many people interpret that to meaning that it could not be used in the trials. And so the widespread belief is that, well, one, that the Truth and Reconciliation Commission was actually a barrier to justice proceedings, that it was a second-rate substitute and actually an obstacle to greater accountability. But in fact, what I discovered is that both Truth Commission's reports have been submitted regularly as evidence in these cases. And in fact, they provide a really interesting historical context that has allowed these courts, these judges, and these prosecutors to understand the structure of the military and how actually the chain of command functioned. And of course, there's a whole host of evidence that goes into that, but the Truth Commission played a vital role in doing something that courts can't do, which is put together a context of the society, the historical narrative of why this happened when it did. The armed conflict, and especially the crimes that were committed, is still a very taboo topic in Guatemala. And there's a variety of opinions amongst even human rights activists about whether these things should be public. Some human rights attorneys believe that this is part of our truth-telling and that it's very important that they be shared with a broader public audience. Others don't want them to be shared at all because there is very sensitive information that's contained within those cases. So I'm now sort of in this crossroads of figuring out how to balance those concerns, how to balance the sensitivity of the privacy and confidentiality of the witnesses that came forward, the victims and their families, but also wanting people to have knowledge about the incredible work that's been done by prosecutors and human rights activists in Guatemala to bring justice in a context where impunity is rampant. My philosophy around this is that you can't really generalize about a victim's experience, and that different people feel healed or vindicated by different things. And so I guess I hesitate to sort of generalize the experience, but certainly I could see pieces of what the archives could provide to people that are searching for it, I guess. I think, I mentioned some of the dualities and sort of some of the kind of narratives and collective memory that exists. I think that there are some really, even more than the ones I've mentioned, some really interesting nuances that are revealed through looking in depth at these cases. So there's definitely something to be told about that. I also think it's just so interesting to see the evolution of the court system in Guatemala, and that's a lesson that is clearly taken away. I sort of described the difference between how crimes were charged, right, and how these convictions, what character they took, who were the crimes attributed to. So, and even the evolution within the court itself of how it treats evidence. So, one example of this that's really powerful is if you look at the Miranamak cases, really famous cases in Guatemala, so she was an anthropologist that was doing research on displaced people. And they tried to admit evidence of sort of the defendant's membership in a military unit. And it was rejected by the court because they said it was irrelevant to the underlying proceedings. Interestingly, the Supreme Court reversed that decision and said you had to look at the historical context to understand the crime. And that's how they were able to get basically the organizers who weren't the triggermen, but actually planned the occurrence. And so you see the court's evolution in terms of how it understands these crimes in that very one case. And that's just one example of many examples of sort of how the courts have evolved and their understanding of the human rights violations that occurred there. For me, as someone who has no background in archives whatsoever, this is a totally new world. I've learned, I can't say that I've mastered it, but I've learned, I was able to sit down with some of the other archivists and actually sort of figure out some of the fundamental design of my archives, which was invaluable for me because, as I mentioned, I don't have the expertise in this area, but it needs to be something that has a systemization so that people can learn and access it. So it's not just something that, people have to dig through on their own. I've learned that I need to provide a greater structure in order for it to be accessible and usable by other academics, practitioners, Guatemalans.